Hey, what is up guys? Welcome back to another Java tutorial in our Java tutorial series. And in this tutorial, we are going to be covering abstraction in Java using abstract classes and interfaces. Now, what exactly is abstraction? Well, in programming, abstraction basically means that you're hiding the implementation details of something. So when you declare something abstract, like an abstract class, for example, you don't implement something necessarily. You give the method name and stuff, and then you implement it somewhere else. You're hiding that implementation detail from someone. Now, how does that work? Well, let's start with the abstract classes concept. You can see here I already have a couple classes created. I have a class animal, right here. And then I have a class dog as well. You can see the dog inherits from animal, as it should, because a dog is an animal. Now, this can work just fine and whatnot. However, typically, in this case scenario, you're not going to want to create a generic animal object because there's no such thing as a generic animal, and that's where an abstract class comes in. That's where the concept of abstraction is super powerful. So, how do we implement an abstract class? Well, it's pretty simple actually. So you can see here we have our public class animal. We just put abstract in the class declaration. And so now this becomes an abstract class. What does that exactly do though? Well, let's say we go into our main class, right? And we try to instantiate an animal object. So we say animal A is equal to a new animal. You can see we get a red underline. And so if we go over and we hover over it, you can see cannot instantiate the type animal. And that's because it's an abstract class. When something's abstract, you can't instantiate a new object. It has to be inherited by another class. And that's where the dog class comes in. So let's say in our animal class we have a few different methods that we want. We want eat, we want sleep, and we want speak, because certain animals may do those three things differently. So in an abstract class, you can still do something like public, void, eat, and there won't be any issues here. But typically, when you want a generic method that you don't want animal to have its own implementation, you want anything that inherits from it to you want it to have to implement it on its own unique implementation of it. You would do it like this. So public abstract void eat with the opening and closing parentheses and then a semicolon. We do that also with public abstract void sleep and then public abstract void speak. Right? So now these are abstract methods, and when you have abstract methods and they're created like this, whatever class inherits from this. So for example, in dog, this inherits animal. Dog will now be required to inherit these three methods and implement them itself. Otherwise, it'll throw an error with a red line and all that stuff. And we can see this right here. You can see the type dog must implement the inherited abstract methods. So let's do that. And we learned about polymorphism and how we override functions. That's what we need to do here, right? So we'll say at override public void eat at override public void sleep and then at override public void speak. Right, that's pretty cool. So now you can see we no longer have any errors. I will say, system out print line eating from let's say eating from a bowl full of mushy food, right? And then you can say system out print line sleeping in a dog bed. And then you can say, and then for speak, system out print line woof. Right? So with that, that's our dog implementation. You can do any amount of animals that you need. For example, or at least with this example, there are other examples that you can experiment with, but this is one of the more obvious examples. So we have that. And what if we go into our main class? Can we use animal as our base type, but have it instantiate instead a new dog? Well, if we go about doing that, you can see it works. You can do that. Now, why can you do that exactly? Well, it's because you're not technically instantiating an object of animal, right? So if we say a dot, and then we go and say eat a dot speak a dot sleep, and we save it, and then we run the code. You can see we get eating from a bowl full of mushy food, woof, and sleeping in a dog bed, because technically A is a dog object, right? But typically you're not going to do that. Usually you're going to say dog, and then call it D. Dog D equals new dog, something like that. Right? And then we get the same result. Now, you can, right? You can have an abstract class with both abstract methods and a normal method inside of it. But you got to keep in mind that if you have an abstract method in a class, that class has to be abstract. Otherwise, it's not going to work. All right, so that's how abstract classes and abstract methods work. We next move on to another type of abstraction, and that's with interfaces. Now, an interface is basically the same thing as an abstract class, except for one small difference. In an interface, you usually, depending on the Java version, do not want to have methods with an implementation inside of interfaces. It is important to note that in Java 8, I believe it is, they added the ability, it was either Java 8 or Java 7, they added default methods to interfaces that you can have an implementation. And then Java 9, they added the ability to have private methods to reduce redundancy from the default methods and whatnot. But those aren't very often used, and they're not really required. You don't have to use them if you don't want to, so I'm not really going to cover them. I will provide documentation in the comments for it, though, so you guys can learn how that works and in what instances you can use it. But typically it's common practice to only have abstract methods in an interface. So that's one thing. Another thing about interfaces is when you provide an abstract method, you do not need to provide the abstract keyword. So how does an interface exactly work? Well, it's pretty simple, actually. So we're going to get rid of these abstract methods. And we're going to call this, instead of a class, instead of an abstract class, we're going to call this an interface. So public interface. Oh, the I is supposed to be lowercase. There. Public interface animal. Now this is an interface. And then in our body, this is where we add our abstract methods. And again, you don't need the abstract keyword. So we'll say void or public void eat public void sleep public void speak. Right? So that is basically how you would typically go about doing an interface. It's basically an abstract class and an interface are basically lists of required methods to implement for anything that inherits or implements from it. So now, if we go into our dog class, right, after we save our interface here, we go into the dog class. You can see we get an error. We can't extend an interface. We have to implement an interface. So we implement animal. Now, we don't get an error. Everything's fine and dandy. Now, one thing about implementing interfaces that is pretty cool compared to extending classes is when you're inheriting classes, you can only inherit from one class at a time. Whereas if you're implementing from an interface, you can implement from multiple interfaces at the same time. So if you have two interfaces that apply to a specific type of object, and you need implementations from both of those interfaces in that class, you can implement that both those interfaces, and it won't cause any issues, which is pretty neat. Now, of course, you're probably going to run into a few little nuance issues if the interfaces have their own specific have their own methods called the same thing, but Eclipse should guide you through how to fix that, or IntelliJ, or whatever IDE you're using. But usually, more often than not, you're not going to come across that issue, unless you have a poorly programmed or poorly structured project. So there's really no need to worry about that too much. Right. So with that being said, we have our interface made, and then we have our interface implemented into our dog class. Let's go ahead and run and save everything, and you can see we still get the same result as we did before. So to reiterate, before we end off here, an abstract class is basically a type of class where you cannot instantiate an object of. You have to extend it so you have to create a child class and then have the abstract class be its parent. Any abstract methods you have to 100% implement into the child. You don't have a choice. However, if a method that you are required to implement doesn't have a specific implementation for the child class, you can just leave it blank. It's not going to cause any problems. In an abstract class, you can have methods with an implementation, and there's no issue there. However, with an interface, you still have abstract methods. You don't need to put the abstract keyword because it automatically assumes that any method that you put in the style of the public void or the public return type, method name, opening, closing, parenthesis, and semicolon at the end is going to be an abstract method. That's what it automatically assumes. But it's not. You usually don't want to have methods with implementations inside of an interface, although you can have default methods, and you can have private, I think they're private static methods. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that, but typically you're not going to find those. You might find them in more modern applications, but not in legacy applications or applications that have an older code base. And sometimes even in new code bases, you're not going to find it because not very many people use that feature, but it is there in case you want to use it or need to use it in some scenario. So that's basically it, guys, for this video. Thank you all so very much for watching. I hope you learned something. If you didn't quite understand something in this video, that's absolutely fine. Check the link in the description for some documentation, some other articles on the topic, and you can also leave a comment asking a question down below. Yeah, thank you all so very much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.